on. The damage to the aircraft was severe, and the oxygen supply was unserviceable. It meant they'd have to fly below 10,000 feet, riskily low over enemy territory. The engines were still running, but it looked as if they had a fuel leak. Did they have a chance of getting to an emergency airfield? At last, the navigator announced they had crossed the border. The Lancaster was rumbling ominously. Did they have enough fuel to make it across the freezing channel now? Cautious hope crept into their hearts as they left the clouds on the mainland and flew over the waves at a few hundred feet under a starlit sky. Finally, they crossed the English coast. After flying for 10.5 hours, they finally made an emergency landing back at East Kirkby. Home was indeed when the props stopped turning. And as they slowed into stillness, the shattered crew climbed down to be greeted by an anxious ground staff. The fire tender and the ambulance at the side of the runway were a reassuring sight. Even in the dark, it was plain to see that our Lancaster had suffered significant damage. Hardly surprising in the view of what we'd been through. But the very fact that she'd survived the dive and got us home was a remarkable testimony to Roy Chadwick, the Lancaster's designer, and the woman who'd built her at the Woodford Avro factory. Rarely had I been more pleased to see the smiling young wife holding out my mug of steaming hot tea and rum. The whole trip had been a complete nightmare and a baptism of fire for young Duggan. He had it all ahead of him now, but I also knew he would be able to cope with anything after that. Ted and his crew had been to hell and back, but at least they'd flown and survived their final sortie. A feeling of immense relief washed over me. I'd survived a total of 37 missions, and now it was all over. No more long hours waiting for the thudding vibration of cannon shells to rip into our aircraft. No more contemplating the fleeting seconds between life and death. It was done. But unlike so many of our friends and fellow airmen, we would, after all, have a life to live. Now they would disperse and each would be alone again. Even as we stood later in the spring sunshine, I knew a page had turned on a chapter of my life, which would see no equal. Never again would I experience anything remotely like the previous 7 months. They looked back at their battle-weary Lancaster for the last time. By a strange coincidence, it was the very aircraft that had flown them on their first mission, what seemed like a century earlier.
Hurrah! Hello, John.
Hello, Ben. How are you?
That's very well. Thank you for reading. That was of my choosing. There was another passage which John was quite keen to read as well, but I think we reviewed it and agreed. But no, thank you so much for joining us. We've got 65 people so far and counting. I'm expecting a lot more, hopefully, over the time. I'll keep an eye on that. So let's have a chat, and thank you to everyone who's joined. Thank you to everyone who's sent in questions. I've got a little line of questions which I'll refer to at the relevant times. So I'm going to start with John. You as a tornado navigator, aren't you? Mm-hmm. And it's actually 30 years. You reminded me, actually 30 years since the Iraq crisis and the Iraq War. And so that obviously has fairly bittersweet memories for you, I suspect. But can you describe I mean, you were in the RAF for about 4 years, weren't you, before you then were called into action?
I joined the RAF in 1981. I joined in the ranks. I was a technician for 5 years, and then I got commissioned and trained as a tornado navigator. And it was the Cold War. We never expected to go to war. Any older veterans of my advancing years in their 50s and 60s will know that at the height of the Cold War in the 70s and the 80s, the notion of going to war was an anathema. And then that all changed in August 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And what we never ever imagined would have happened in Europe was about to kick off 3,000 miles away in a desert very few of us could have pointed to on a map. And it was a shock. But it's strange to say, we wanted to be part of it. We wanted to go because we had been like firefighters who had never been to a fire, who'd never put a fire out. We were like medics who'd never treated anybody who was ill. And for us, it was a chance to prove ourselves. And so we wanted to go. And 30 years ago to the day, was when my squadron started deploying out to the Gulf region, and we were based in Bahrain. So it's amazing to think that 30 years ago, if you'd said to me, I would be talking about what is Lancaster, is that my 16th book? If you'd have said then that after this experience in the Gulf, you'll write books and you'll be talking about the Lancaster in 30 years' time, it would have been unbelievable to think about.
I can imagine. I can imagine. And so your role when you got to Bahrain was, were you flying every day? Was it were there sorties? What were your responsibilities?
Well, as a navigator, you know, we were planning the missions ready for if combat operations started, which they did in the January of 1991. We were practicing every single day. We'd never practiced with full weapons loads on before. We'd never flown with a full weapons load, ever. It just was not something that you did in peacetime. We were practicing ultra low flying over the desert for daytime operational flying. So flying over the desert at maybe 30 or 40 feet and about 600 miles an hour. And at night, we were flying using the Tornado's amazing automatic terrain following radar system, so that at maybe 550, 600 miles an hour, at 200 feet in the darkness, you would set up the aircraft, the pilot would take his hands off the controls, and the aircraft would fly itself, completely fly itself towards the target. And almost everything could be completed by the aircraft, apart from the physical act of releasing the bombs. Everything else could be done by the aircraft. And so we were rehearsing that in preparation for the war starting.
Wow. Okay. And I did get one question, which is probably a good. William Ward sent me an email saying, the role of a navigator, how has that changed? Obviously, the role you would have done, you did back in the 90s, how would that have compared to the navigators in the Lancaster?
Very different. A navigator is probably, the Americans call them weapons systems officers, and that's probably more of a realistic terminology. Basically, the navigation you have set up beforehand, you've pre-programmed the computers, and so you're keeping the weapon systems up to date, you're keeping the targeting systems up to date, you're keeping the navigation and the main computer up to date, you're looking at the defensive profiles of the aircraft, so it's much more of a battle space manager than the Lancaster was in for the Lancaster navigators, who literally were working with a compass and a piece of pen and a compass and a protractor and a paper, which is what we trained. That's how we trained in the mid 1980s. And of course now there are no navigators. And so there's the old joke of, what do you say to a navigator who's left the Air Force? You say 2 Big Macs and a large fries, please. Because there are no navigators. They're all the pilot does everything now. There are a couple of 2-seat aircraft, but most of them are now single seat. And any navigator is now a true weapons systems officer.
Yeah. Okay. And on the fateful day, I was reading it. You were taken down by a handheld kind of rocket, which seems extraordinary. Was that just a lucky shot, or was this
Well, I mean, our jet was what, 25 million quid, something like that. And the handheld surface-to-air missile is probably buying the black market for maybe 500, £1,000, something like that. So lucky shot? No, I mean, it was a targeted shot, but it was a heat-seeking missile, so we never saw it coming. And it just knocked us out of the sky. I mean, it really was. We were flying at about 30 feet, and we nearly hit the ground, in actual fact.
And what was the first you were aware? Did you have some sort of beeping thing saying incoming missile?
No. We were hit. Literally, we were flying along about 30 feet and 600 miles an hour, and the aircraft is just knocked as though it's been hit by an express train, knocked sideways. So no, we couldn't. We had no indication at all, in actual fact.
Okay, so did your ejector seat just have deployed immediately?
No. My pilot, we managed to get hold of the aircraft, get it back under control. We were trying to edge our way back to the border, but the aircraft was on fire, the engines were on fire, and so then you eject. You don't. It doesn't do it automatically. You have to pull the handle and eject.
Yeah. Okay. I'm conscious we don't want to take too much time talking about tornado. Everyone's here to hear about Lancaster, aren't they? But it is fascinating it's fascinating. You're a piece of history, and that shot of you on the TV is one of the iconic shots of the 90s, arguably.
Well, yes. I mean, that myself and my pilot John Peters paraded on TV. That kind of it became one of the defining images of that conflict with a couple of the other prisoners of war, some of the Americans. And it's curious, Ben, if I had not been shot down, if I had not been tortured and paraded on TV, I wouldn't be talking to you this evening. I wouldn't be. There's no doubt about it. I don't know what I would have been doing, but my career as a writer started in the aftermath of that, and because I was one of the ones who was forced, albeit at gunpoint, under the pain of death, to appear on TV.
Yeah. You have to excuse me. I'm just turning people's videos off as they.
No, that's fine. There's somebody just.
But I will persevere with that. So
somebody just contacted me via Twitter, Paul Jackson, to say that they can't get in. I don't know if you can see anybody. It doesn't really matter, but
there's nobody. There's nobody waiting.
There's nobody else waiting. That's fine. It must be his system. Don't worry about it.
Move it on there. I didn't know Paul Jackson, so I didn't. Anyway, so moving back to World War II, you've obviously made a career out of authoring since the 90s, since your career ended as a pilot, as an RAF officer. What made you choose authoring particularly, and why these particular subjects, Spitfire and Lancaster?
Well, Tornado Down, the first book, that kind of came about obviously because of the experiences. That was 1991, obviously. The book came out in 1992. Everybody was interested. And I kind of then never thought anything more about it until I left the Air Force in 96 and was looking for a new career. As I say, as a navigator, not much you can do outside in that sense. And somebody said to me, why don't you think about writing a novel? And so I did. I wrote 5 novels in the 90s, all of which did reasonably well. And then after that, somebody said, why don't you start looking at some subjects using your connections with the veterans to talk to them about their experiences. And that's how those books started back in 1999, 2000. And, they've gone on, they've been successful. And so, it's curious, as I said to you earlier, I would never. I've got an English O level, and that's it. I left school at 16, so I've got a couple. I got my 8 O levels, 2 English O levels. But the notion of making a career out of writing was not something I ever thought about. And so it kind of happened to me. I've been lucky, Ben. I've been lucky that my life has turned out this way.
Well, in many ways, we're benefiting from your luck in that case, because some of the personal memoirs you've written for many of these people connected is extraordinary, and I found a lot of the contents of this is so emotive and so emotional, and there remains a rawness about it. And I can only say thank you from my perspective. So almost the story starts in here where you reference someone like Ron Needle, and you take him around Hendon Air Museum. Yeah. And Hendon Air Museum is very close to my heart, as part of anything else. That was my classic kind of default setting when I had the kids. Me and my wife wanted an afternoon off or something, so I would naturally take them to Hendon Air Museum, just the most beautiful place. And the story you have of taking Ron Needles there and him attempting to speak to the children and not being able to sort of enunciate words just because of the raw emotion that remains, and you thankfully you stepped in.
Yeah, so Ron was what, 94, 95. I took him down to go and visit the Hendon Lancaster. I wanted to be with him. It's part of the way that I write. It's not just about speaking to the guys and the ladies. It's about getting them to relive their experience. And if you could put them next to that aircraft, the emotions are much more raw, much more real. And we were there chatting, and we were looking around. He was describing the Lancaster from his point of view. And there's a group of school kids there, young, 7, 8, something like that. And the curator was showing them the Lancaster and saying, this is the Lancaster, and look at this, this is where the rear gunner sat. And the curator said to them, like, it was really cold for them. And I stepped in and said, you've actually got a real rear gunner here. He's there. He's this guy in the wheelchair that I'm with. And the kids, their eyes were on stalks. And Ron kind of told them a little bit about it. I told them a little bit about it. But the kids were just so enamored that Ron became really, really overwhelmed. And he had a lump in his throat, and I had a lump in my throat. And these kids were just, they couldn't believe that this machine that they'd been told about from 75 years previously, this man in the wheelchair had been at the heart of that. And it was an amazing experience. And, it opens the book because it tells the story of the Lancaster and what it was like for the guys.
Exactly. Such a lovely moment and a lovely way to start the book. Right, let's talk about Lancaster. So as of 1941, it didn't exist in 40, and so the bombers at the time were things like Blenheims and Wellingtons, and I think the main forerunner was the Manchester, which I understand was an absolute dog. Is that?
Yeah. Look, you have to remember that at the start of the war, the aviation was still in its infancy. When did the Wright brothers? When did they first go on? 1902, I think it was, something like that. So it's not that long. It was about 30 odd years since the Wright brothers had got airborne in what was in effect a lawnmower with some balsa wood and some string and some paper or some material. And it wasn't that long before the First World War and the very basic aircraft of the First World War, and then the Second World War with the early heavy bombers. There were people flying who remembered the Wright brothers. They remembered the first flights. And so the early bombers were pretty rubbish. They just weren't, they weren't powerful enough. They couldn't carry a big enough payload. And it's a brutal thing to say, but what was the purpose of a bomber in World War II? To deliver massive amounts of bombs over Nazi-controlled territory and destroy infrastructure, kill people involved in waging war. That's what it was about. It's a brutal thing to say, but it was, and it was a total war. And we might talk about the rights and wrongs of bombings a bit later if you want to.
Yeah.
And so the development of the Lancaster was driven by the need to carry more bombs into the heart of Nazi-controlled Europe and drop them. And that was basically it. And war, whether it's about the Spitfire, whether it's about the Hurricane, or whether it's about the Lancaster, or whether it's about the submarine or a ship, it's a driver of technology. And the Lancaster was driven by war.
Yeah, exactly. So Avro, who then became Hawker Siddeley, you had the two Roys, Roy Chadwick and Roy Dobson, combined to get their heads together to work out how on earth to carry a heap load of bombs in a plane that could handle it. So and they came up with a sort of 4-engined vehicle compared to the 2-engined
that's right, yeah,
Manchester.
Yeah.
And but they acted sort of almost independently. It feels as though they weren't actually being guided by the government. They felt there was a solution out there rather than they were working with the government. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think that if you look at the way that conflict drives development, the government basically we needed heavy bombers, and there were a number under production. So there was the Lancaster, there was the Halifax. There were a number of bombers under production, the Mosquito, and various companies were striving forward to try to get their development under production. And you could probably liken it perhaps to the vaccine search at the moment. The government doesn't care. The government doesn't care who produces the vaccine as long as somebody comes up with a damn vaccine. And they're willing to throw money at it. And that was the same with whether it was about guns or ammunition or about bombers. Money was thrown at it. Build us heavy bombers, prove that they work, and we will commission you. And in the end, what was it, 7,377 Lancasters were built. It's an astonishing number of massive bombers to be constructed in a very short space of time.
No, absolutely, absolutely. So Lancasters were built in Chatterton and Yeadon. Now, I didn't know that. I mean, I'm showing my ignorance here. That there was also a factory in Canada, and I'm going to say a big shout out to Fiona, who's dialed in from Canada actually for this one.
Hi, Fiona.
And I was particularly entranced by the stories about how they camouflaged the Yeadon factory.
Yeah. Well, so obviously, they're massive factories, they're massive production facilities. If you look at some of the photographs in the book, they are absolutely enormous. And obviously, what do the Germans want to do? The same as the Germans are building giant bombers to bomb our war-making facilities. And so what they want to do is, if they can destroy 100 Lancasters on the ground or stop 1,000 being built, that's far better than trying to shoot them down over Berlin. And so the factories had to be disguised. And so you had a Hollywood designer was over in the UK working with the Americans, and basically they disguised the factory. So what they did is they used bulldozers to push earth up against the sides of the factory, against the walls. So instead of them being flat, they were slanted, and then they planted them with seed, with grass seed, and grass grew, and they put it across the whole of the roof as well. So if you're looking down from 10, 15,000 feet, you get no sense of a different shade or a different light. It just looks like a field. They had model cows and sheep. That they built fences around the factory so it looked like farmland, and they had model cows and sheep. And it was people's job in the morning, before light, to move these model cows and sheep around, so it looked as though cows had moved in the fields. And so it was an amazing, all-encompassing feat to get the Lancasters produced, built, put together, off to the airfields, and then get the guys trained to actually fly them into danger.
I know. I was quite amused at the idea that even local delivery drivers didn't know where it was because how good the camouflage was. It was extraordinary. And so they were happy with the Lancaster as it was. There's so many commentary on what a wonderful plane it was to fly, and you've got so many interviews in the book. And Bomber Harris was the man given charge of now he's obviously taken his levels of criticism.
Very much so, yeah.
We perhaps will cover him off sort of later on. The first thing I noted, and it shocked me rigid, was he was only 49 when he took the job, which to me that seems extraordinarily young. But anyway, never mind. I'll move on from my.
But the thing is, Ben, if Harris was 49 as a senior commander, some of the guys who were flying the Lancasters were 18 and 19.
Oh, man.
Especially some of the gunners who didn't have that much training. Some of the pilots were 21. Some of the squadron commanders who commanded the squadron, so they had 15 Lancasters or something like that, and 20 or 30 crews working under them. They might be 26, 27, 28. This was a young man's game. If you were in your 30s, you were old.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I read that maybe there was one person in their 30s during the whole book that I read. Yeah. But and their first bombing mission, it was Augsburg, which didn't. I mean, it was a fairly inauspicious start because the 8 of the 12 Lancs were shot down, and losing 49 of the 85 crew, which can't have been a good start to the whole process.
Well, it was claimed as a success. I mean, it was a daylight raid, at relatively low level. So, the Lancasters' main way of operating was at night mass bombing of industrial targets. It was a daylight raid, so they could be seen. So the factory was quite heavily defended, and then they ran into a number of different German fighters as well. Luck conspired against them, and it was a disaster in numbers terms. It was never presented as a disaster to the public. It was a success. We bombed the factory, and the factory was put out of action for a certain period of time. Nobody looked at the numbers in the way that today we would look at casualties. You know, if you look at the overall numbers who died in Bomber Command, they're astonishing, 55,500, something like that. Nobody looked at it that way then. There was a war to be fought. This was the way to fight it, and that was it. And nobody thought, ooh, 10 people died tonight, or 100 people died tonight, or 500 people died. They didn't think that way then. This was a total war against an existential threat, and it was a total war for the nation's very survival.
I think what you get beautifully in the book is the, I mean, whilst the outside world kind of just saw the Bomber Command as doing a job, there wasn't an emotional attachment to it. There wasn't an empathy with what they were going through. Some of the stories you talk about where, you know, beds are unoccupied that night after the raid, and that the kind of what that means in terms of civilian, in terms of casualties, and the impact that has on just one airbase of so many across the country. You tell that so beautifully, and obviously that's stories from so many different airmen. You can't help but be moved by that. And it's very hard for us to really understand how the impact of what an empty bed means, and those people whose job it was then to remove that missing aircrew's belongings. I mean, there were people whose jobs it was to go in there every night.
The committee of adjustment. I mean, I think that the difference, Ben, was that first of all, the whole country was at war. The nation was at war. There was no social media. There was no 24-hour news. There was no morning TV shows criticizing the government, picking apart an operation and saying, right, well, you know, you launched that operation on Berlin last night. Perhaps if you'd have done it this way, it would have been better. Perhaps if you'd used a different squadron, it might have been different. It wasn't like that. It was a mass all-out battle. And they didn't really understand the death toll. You know, so yes, you would have a Nissan hut with perhaps 2 crews in, so 7 beds down one side, 7 beds down the other. One crew would come home, the other crew were never seen again. Empty bed, and their possessions had to be cleared away. It was called the Committee of Adjustment. They went along and they didn't have many possessions. There was no wardrobe. They didn't have a room. They had a bedside table and perhaps you know, a wash bag, a brush, a photograph. It was all bagged up, and it went off to Uxbridge, RAF Uxbridge, just outside London, where all of the bags were collected. And if you went into the hangar there, you saw tens of thousands of bags, tens of thousands of lives stuffed into bags, a brush, a pair of braces. And I detail one of the guys. I go through it in quite detail because his family didn't really know immediately that he was killed. And the process of finding out that their loved one had died was torturous. And they eventually got
Stan Shaw, wasn't it?
Yeah, Stan Shaw. Well, I interviewed his daughter, who's still alive. So her memories, what was she then, 9 or 10? Her memories of her dad, her last memories of her dad, see him off to get on the bus when he's in his RAF uniform, going back to base, and that was it. He never appeared again. They never really knew what happened. They still don't know what happened. He was never spoken about again in the family. They just got a couple of telegrams. He's missing. We're still looking. A month later, we think he's dead. If he's dead, these are the allowances that you'll get. A couple of months after that, he's definitely dead, although we can't prove it. There's just no, but here's his belongings. A brown parcel the size of a shoebox. And it detailed 1 pen, 1 pair of braces, 2 pairs of underpants clean, 1 5p, 1 5p coin. And that was it. His life arrived back. They knew nothing about him, nothing. And that was repeated over and over again, tens and tens and tens of thousands. I think it's important to say as well, I also tell the stories of the Germans who were suffering at the same time in the same way. Young families, people dying, people being killed.
Listen, we could take this conversation in so many directions. In talking about Stan Shaw, he died in the raid on, excuse my pronunciation, is it Peenemünde? Is it Peenemünde?
Peenemünde.
Which was, that's where the German scientists were forging the V1, V2 rockets. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me just mute David.
That's all right. We've just heard David's dog. I'm delighted.
And I think if there's anything that sort of typified the importance of the bombing, and probably why everyone considers the bombing to have been so significant in terms of the Allies winning the war, it's the stifling of the scientists' development work and the destruction of Peenemünde and a lot of the other stuff they were doing. I think the entire scientific team at Peenemünde then got transferred to NASA after the war.
After the war,
working on rockets. That's how good they were.
Yeah.
So the impact of them, if they'd been given free range, would have had a massive change in the course of the war. I would.
Well, I mean, it did. You know, it was, you know, the V1s, the Doodlebugs, obviously caused considerable disruption in the southeast. The V2 rockets, the giant rockets, the first ballistic missiles, also caused hideous damage and deaths as well. But you know, again, that was part of the overall strategy of the war. Yes, we were trying to destroy the Nazis' weapons building facilities in the small centres, but we were also trying to destroy their industrial heartland so they couldn't fight the war. You know, so attacking the massive industrial heartlands of Dusseldorf, Bremen, the massive rail junctions, the dams, obviously. It was all part of the strategy. When you're waging war, you're fighting a total war, and you're trying to destroy your enemy's ability to wage war. So yes, Peenemünde just trying to destroy the V1 rocket facilities before they were even produced was important, and we caused considerable damage. And then later in the war, we went after the firing facilities that were in France, in northern France. We went after them. We were trying to destroy every aspect of the Germans' ability to wage conflict.
Yeah. Peenemünde was also quite an important one because clearly the Germans had spotted a weakness with the Lancaster, the sort of the bare underbelly, as it were. Mm-hmm. And so planes would specifically position themselves under the German planes underneath the Lancaster, which seems like a very risky thing to do with bombs potentially raining down. Well, but they had what was nicknamed jazz guns or something, or Schrager music, they called it.
Schrager music, jazz music. And basically, it was an upward firing cannon. So if you think about the Spitfire or any of the standard German or British fighters, they had, you know, 4, 6, 8 machine guns pointing forward, and the aircraft had to maneuver in. They would try to maneuver in behind the Lancaster, which is what the Lancaster rear gunner was there for, and they would try to attack the aircraft from behind. With this new system, in the dark, they could actually try and sneak under their aircraft, and their upward firing guns would just tear through the Lancaster. And the Lancaster would not know, the crews would not know what was happening to them. They would just know that they were blasted apart. And it certainly caused considerable terror and damage to the attacking aircraft over a period of time.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give a little shout out to another interview I did previously, because the information regarding Peenemünde came from bugging walls in houses around. Was it Trent Park and
it was in
Trent House? There was a book written by Helen Fry called The Walls Have Ears. Now, we interviewed Helen, and that is an interview on our YouTube channel, which I would love to point everyone towards. She's since written another book called MI9, which is another reference. But that, where do we take it from here? Some of the bombing, you would argue, and I'm definitely an advocate for supporting, because you didn't really know what the outcome was going to be in the war. So some of the bombing you could argue was a little bit over the top, and the kind of some of the destruction. No, I'm not going to jump on Dresden at all, because I think Dresden was actually a very important industrial hub. There was a lot of Nazi activity there, a lot of factories. Would you say something like Hamburg or one or two were perhaps beyond?
Well, I think that what you have to do is you have to look at it in the round. So first of all, war's a brutal business. And to stop the enemy from waging war, you had to attack it at its heartland. And that meant attacking the industrial heartlands. So whether it was Hamburg, whether it was Dresden, Dresden's a classic example of, in actual fact, perhaps it might be easier to actually focus on Dresden in actual fact, because people said, so first of all, there was no laser guided bombs that the Lancaster had. There was no precision bombing. If you wanted to bomb a factory in Hamburg, if you wanted to bomb the U-boat factories, you had to drop thousands of tons of weapons on the area, because you didn't aim them with precision. They were, depending on the system, you could aim them with some accuracy, but not to within 100, 200, 300, 400 yards. You were really area bombing to destroy the overall capability. There's no doubt about that. So that's the main reason that they went about it that way. Dresden's the classic example. So people say Dresden, oh, well, the war was nearly over, so it was wrong to attack Dresden. Well, if you were in 1944, if you were still fighting the war, you had no concept, sorry, 1945, you had no concept that the war was nearly over. The V2 rockets were still falling on London. The Germans were getting their jet fighters up in the air. You'd had the disaster at Arnhem only a few months before. You'd had the Battle of the Bulge, where tens of thousands had been killed and the Germans had pushed back. V2 rockets were flying across the channel. So there was no concept then that the war was nearly over, none at all. And you prosecute a battle until the enemy surrenders. You don't stop halfway through and say, okay, let's see what happens. You prosecute a battle until it ends. Dresden was an industrial heartland. People say there was no targets there. It was being fortified against the Russian advance from the east, which was incredibly important. One of the prime reasons the war was being fought that way. So the Russians were advancing from the east, and we needed them to get through. There's no doubt about that. So it was being fortified. It was a major hub for bringing troops through back and forward to the line. So it was a legitimate target. It was the only way it could be attacked was mass bombing. And then, of course, the numbers got exaggerated. So there's only one reliable number for the casualties of Dresden. If you look online, you'll find anything between 200,000 and 500,000 deaths. There's only one reliable source. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It was the concentration camp, the Nazi concentration camp guards from the nearby concentration camp. They came in to dispose of the bodies in the aftermath. And they, because the Germans were very good at statistics, they counted, I think it was about 20,000, something like that, bodies. Still horrific, no need to exaggerate. You could probably double that, because there were so many refugees that were there killed. There was Russian refugees. There were some of our prisoners of war were there. So let's just double it to maybe 40,000. Still horrific beyond belief. But then what happened over time? Within days, actually, the Germans, Goebbels, inflated it by tenfold and started the argument then about the numbers being killed. And then people had used this as a factually incorrect stick for which to discuss the bombing during World War II. And I would say, so when you said, was Hamburg perhaps a step too far? Well, I think you'd then have to say to the Atlantic convoys who are being, there was thousands and thousands being killed on our Atlantic convoys by the German U-boats. They wouldn't say it was. They wouldn't say that bombing the German U-boat factories was a step too far. So you can't just look at it in isolation and say, what about this, what about that? You have to look at it in the round of, how do you fight a war where the enemy's role is to annihilate and overrun you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, as a result of Dresden, Churchill almost almost put blame onto the bomber Harris, and which in some ways that sours sort of Churchill's sort of heritage in a way, I suspect. But that his change of tack could well have had an impact on the nation's kind of view, and that's a very unfortunate kind of position, because I think, I having read everything, I would argue that the air crew involved in the bombings were the bravest. You could argue the bravest people involved in World War II. I mean, there were single brave acts such as D-Day, which are extraordinary, but day after day to just be going in is just extraordinary.
Harris made this point when he was arguing about this afterwards. So the Bomber Command was abandoned by Churchill, and even back in the 1940s, there was a sense that Churchill was part of the way that Dresden had been prosecuted. He was part of the people saying, I want you to attack the cities. I want you to support the Russians. I'm ordering you to do this. Make it so. But Churchill's a politician. We know politicians. He could see the tide was turning, and the devastation wreaked upon Germany was terrible. You can't get away from that. It was terrible. The death toll was horrific. And some of the accounts that I have of German civilians dying are absolutely horrific. But in the aftermath, Bomber Command felt quite hard done to. And for many, many, many years, they kept quiet about what they'd done. People were not interested. The Fighter Command was lauded. Fighter Command was lauded, the Battle of Britain, etc., etc. But Bomber Command was not. And it was quite tough for some of these guys, actually, for 40, 50, 60 years. Quite tough. Because, and then there's a number of quotes in the book where, somebody would say, well, you're a bomber, you're murdering women and children. But they were, they would laud the fighter pilot, but attack the bomber pilot. And there is still some of that today. You still get paint splashed on Arthur Harris's statue in London. The Bomber Command War Memorial in Green Park has been defaced twice, I think. So there is still some of that there. And these men are now in their 90s, late 90s.
Yeah. And Hitler's reaction to much of this towards the end was to ignore the Geneva Convention and just basically say the army don't have to protect them, which astonished me with some of the stories. Is it Pforzheim, Huckenheld?
Yes.
The story of there, Tom Tate, which the brutality shown by the Germans on the crew that were marched through the town and marched up to the village. And if it weren't for, Tom Tate had a view through the door into where they were heading and saw these nooses hung over the, that's just an extraordinary thing. And he had the foresight and you would, wouldn't you, to run at that point and manage to escape it. Whereas the rest of them didn't. And I think, I found that reading your book, I would disappear off into Google land for periods of time. So a single paragraph could take me 3 days to read, just because.
I think you talk about the lynchings, and so they were, there were a number of bomber crew murdered, lynched by civilians, either by locals or more formally they were shot. The Pforzheim one is a classic example where they were going to hang them in the barn. Tom Tate managed to run away, but then they just shot the rest of them in the church graveyard. And the next day, the Germans were going to church, walking around the bodies of the murdered British aircrew. Now, and so we say that is horrific, but hold on. It's really important to say that the Germans weren't the only ones doing this. If you go to the Imperial War Museum in London, there are contemporary accounts in the 1940s of this happening to German crews being shot down in South London. And again, and you can see this, and I explain this in Pforzheim. Sorry, my wife has messaged me to say every time I cross my legs, you can see my naked, because I've got shorts on under this shirt. She's messaged me to say the audience can see my naked legs, which is quite, so I'm sorry about that, audience. And so this is what happened. And so in Pforzheim, I tell the story of why some of them were shot. So the town had been devastated. It was rubble. Thousands of civilians, men, women, children had been killed. One of the young boys who shot one of our bomber crews he was given a pistol. He was desperate with grief because he had dragged his mother and his sister out of the rubble and were both dead. And one of the Nazi locals gave him a pistol and said, "These are the men responsible," and he shot one of them in the head. And it sounds brutal when you say that about a 15-year-old boy, but if you have lost your loved ones, if you've dragged them out of rubble, you can understand why this happens. And it happened in the UK, there's no doubt about that.
No, I read that one, and in one of my deviations into Google land, and there were a series of meetings through the sort of 1980s and 90s at Huckenheld. And during one church service, apparently an elderly man walked up to one of the celebrants at the back and just said, I was that young man who shot that guy. And he'd lived with that on his conscience all his life. You know, the impact of pulling the trigger and seeing someone die so brutally and so coldly is something that has clearly haunted him all his life.
And of course, Tom Tate, who knew that the rest of his crew had been murdered, he was part of the peace initiative in the 80s and the 90s. He went back to the place where his crew had been brutally murdered, savagely murdered, and left lying in the graveyard. He went back to make peace with the people who had done it, because war's a terrible, hideous, horrible thing.
I'm looking through my notes, seeing so many things I should have asked you. Now, I've had a load of questions. What I will say to everyone watching is there is a chat function which is aimed directly at me. If you fill in a question on the chat bit, you'll see it at the bottom, in the middle of the bottom navigation. Just press that, send a question, and I can put that to John. So I've got two or three. Let's start with Roger Petts. I've just finished reading your outstanding book, Lancaster, and have lived through the war. I can vividly remember the sight of Lancasters flying overhead, although I was only 9 when the war ended. My question is this: why did it take so long to recognise the bravery of bomber crews? I can understand a certain level of horror at destruction and the strategy behind it, but this was created by Harrison Churchill, not the crews. Was there enough effort put into getting recognition?
It's an excellent question. So a couple of things to address. First of all, yes, they were obeying orders, but I think if I was playing devil's advocate, there were other groups of people within Germany who were just obeying orders, and so you can't use that as an excuse. Either something is legal or it is not legal, and I was just obeying orders is not a defense. Now, I would suggest that what they did was not illegal anyway, and it was necessary. Why did it take so long afterwards? Because of the controversy. Because a couple of things, people wanted to move on, there's no doubt about that. Everybody had been at war, but it took the bomber crews. When I was involved in the campaign to get the Bomber Command Memorial built in Green Park. And I can't remember how long ago that was, 10, 15 years. And it took 50 years for them to get that off the ground. And there was a lot of opposition to that. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of opposition to getting the statue of Bomber Harris unveiled in London. It was a controversial subject. I think that the tragedy is now that these men are so old, that so many of them are dying, that many of them who I interviewed for the book have sadly passed away. I think people's views are changing now. They are much more lauded in a way that they were not even 15 or 20 years ago. Now that they are dying, and history is dying before our eyes, then we recognize them much more.
Yes, I mean, it's not dying insofar as, we've got the memories, we've got so many things, and your book is a contributor to that. I mean, one of the things that I will pull from is the fact that if anybody, showed any kind of weakness or, couldn't do it, the term low moral fiber, which seems like a horrible term, just was connected, LMF, and they were physically stripped of their rank. I mean, talk through that, how cold that was.
It was a brutal. It was one of the things that they got wrong, and Harris got wrong, and the leadership got wrong. But I know why they got it wrong. And so basically, if you were psychologically damaged, if you had what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, battle shock, shell shock, of course, from World War One, you were not allowed to say, you couldn't say, I can't go on anymore, I need to rest. You had to go on. And it was a case of pour encourager les autres. You know, if you had one guy on one crew saying, I can't go on, I need to step back from this, what about if you had another guy on another crew? What happens if you had 10 crews? What happens if you had 100 crews? And so they said, you can't do it. We are going, and it was brutal. And it didn't happen all of the time. There was a number of different, depending on where you were, but on a number of occasions, men who had literal mental, physical breakdowns were marched out in front of the whole station, and they would have their badges, their rank torn off them. They would have their medals torn off them, and they would be dispatched to punishment camps where they would be in the cookhouse, where they'd be cleaning the toilets. And it was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to do. But if you go back to the First World War, we put people against a post and shot them if they had shell shock. We call them cowards. And at least it didn't go that far, but it was terrible. Some were treated, and there's a couple of stories in the book about people who were treated as well. But it was not recognized away. And to be fair, it took us quite a long time to recognize it now. You know, post-Falklands, probably going as far as my war in 1991, where we really, really began to understand what post-traumatic stress disorder meant.
Yeah. Right. Let's rattle through a few of these questions. Hopefully we can, or maybe I can combine a few. Anna H. Quick Google shows the Guy Gibson. Well, Guy Gibson, obviously Dan Buster's fame. When he died, he was only 26, which is remarkable. I mean, that obviously reference to the whole age discussion. Why did John pick to write about Lancaster and Spitfires instead of some other types of planes? And actually, Bridget, the next question is: any chance of a book about mosquitoes? What's the mosquito?
So this is the question that I am asked constantly. Why did I choose to write about the Spitfire and the Lancaster? Because my stories, the way I write my books, is to go and be with the veterans, sit with them, have coffee with them, go back. So I took a Spitfire veteran flying in a Spitfire. I got one of my friends to take me in a Spitfire. I took Lancaster veterans back and got them in the Lancaster, clambering around, telling me their stories. And the simple fact is that there are a lot of Spitfire and Lancaster veterans, because we had 7,500 Lancasters and 23,000 Spitfires. So I want personal stories. I want memories. What I can't do is write a book without interviewing the veterans, without having their stories. And so I'm constantly saying, why don't you write the next book about the hurricane? Because there are perhaps one or two people who flew the hurricane left alive. Why don't you write the next book about the mosquito? Because the depth of the stories is no longer there. The veterans aren't there. I'm sad to say that Lancaster probably is going to be the last World War II book I write, because there are not the veterans there now to tell their stories. And more importantly, the veterans that are can't remember their stories in the detail that I want. I write a story that is colourful, that brings in everything from their wives and their daughters and their families and their base, and they're going out and meeting their girlfriends. It's not just a Lancaster's got this many engines and this many nuts and this many bolts. I write a human story, and sadly, you need human stories to do that.
That's right. Wow. And some of them, I made a list going through it of all the different people you referenced the stories from. Maurice Garlick, for instance, just an extraordinary. I'm going to reference him insofar as you start his life, you start his reference in the book by mentioning World War One, and he was witness to the shooting down of the first Zeppelin to be shot down in this country, which is only not that far from Tring. Actually,
that's right.
It's just around around the M25 slightly, and witnessing that and the impact that had on him moving forward. And he in the book, or your book, said directly that without that experience, seeing the Zeppelin, which Honestly, I spent 3 days on Zeppelins when I. I need to look into that more.
But that's what I mean about the human stories, Ben. So I don't just the books don't start with a Lancaster in 1942, 43. They start with the main characters who run through the book when they're children, when they're so some of them in World War One, seeing the very first bombing of the UK of England by the Zeppelins. Some of them in World War II, when they're young kids, during the Blitz, when they're seeing the bombs falling and how that affects their life. And so we follow them all the way through to build up that human story, because Lancaster's a human story. It's a story, it's a machine, but it's a story about people.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Right, see more questions. Jed Swan, how do you get the information when researching your books? How long does it take? So obviously, I mean, some of these interviews you've been doing for 10 years or so.
It takes quite a long time. I start with the basics about the Lancaster, and there are obviously plenty of books written about it, where you can get the basics. But what you can't do is, what I don't want to do, although sometimes I do get criticized for it, I don't want to write another book about the Lancaster. So people say, well, this is more about the stories of the people. I said, yes, because you go on, look in your bookshop, look online. There are 200, 300, 400 books about the Lancaster. You can't say anything else about the Lancaster. What you can say is you can tell a story about the people involved with the Lancaster and how the Lancaster affected their lives. And so I then, because I know many of the veterans, know their associations, I write to, depending on, with Spitfire, probably wrote to a couple of hundred, with Lancaster probably only about 50 or 60 because they're much older. Some of them have written their own personal little stories, and they'll send you a dusty manuscript, typewritten in the 1950s. That's sat in the drawer and say, nobody will be interested in this, but this has sat in my drawer for 40 years. And it's gold dust. It's the most amazing thing. And then but it's not a story on its own, because it's one person's personal story. But you put that together with another 15 personal stories, and then sit with those 15 people for another 2 days, drinking coffee, asking them about their emotions, asking about their feelings, asking about their losses and their fears. Suddenly, you've got the basis for an astonishing flowing narrative about what the Lancaster was, who flew it, what it did, and how it affected those who flew it.
Richard asks, can you ask if John's ever been in in fact, I'll broaden it out, flown in a Spitfire or even a Lancaster? Have you?
Good, excellent question. So, Spitfire, I've got a number of friends who fly the Spitfire now, and they've offered me on a number of occasions a trip, but I've always given over the possibility to one of the veterans to get them back in the air, so that they can experience it, so I can be with them when they experience it. Lancaster's a bit more difficult, so there's only 2 flying ones. The Royal Air Force has got one as part of its Battle of Britain Memorial flight, and you kind of can't just go up in that. Very strict regulations about who flies in that. And there's another one in Canada that does do passenger experience flying, but clearly you've got to have, I don't know what it is, a good few £1,000s and go to Canada to do it. There's another one at East Kirkby in Lincolnshire, at the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre, and they can taxi their Lancaster around. And I've done that a number of times, again with veterans. Gone in with a veteran, got him in, a 90-year-old man getting back into the rear turret, he's throwing his walking stick to one side, and then taxiing around the airfield with him. And that's been a real joy as well. But never flown in a Lancaster, never flown in the Spitfire.
I was we had Roger Moorhouse. I'll give you a name check. No relation to me. Was telling me we were both at the local takeaway the other day. He told me all
about. Hi, Roger.
He's done the taxiing experience, so I'm actually very interested to go and do that myself. How has life? This is from Elizabeth. How has life in the RAF changed from your career to that of a new recruit today? And she then references Helena, age 16, considering the RAF.
Hello, Helena. It is completely different. So I joined when I was 16. And as I said at the beginning of our chat, Ben, when I joined in 1981, nobody expected to go to war. Now, you have to put that in context. So yes, you might end up in Northern Ireland, and yes, there was the conflict in the Falklands. So there were some minor conflicts that went on, though devastating for those involved. But the notion of the Air Force going to war en masse, and so when 45,000 British servicemen and women went out to the Gulf in 1990, it was almost inconceivable. And of course, the deaths and the losses there were terrible. Now, a young serviceman or woman joining the military will know that the chances are that they will see some sort of conflict. Interestingly, if you look from the 90s, when I was, from the First Gulf War, all the way through to probably kind of 2 or 3 years ago, wars were constant. So you had the Second Gulf War, you had Iraq, there were a number of other offspring of that, so Syria, back to Iraq again. And we have some servicemen that I joined up with who are now at the very top of the military command structure, who have a row of medals on their chest. When I joined, nobody had a medal. Maybe one or two, a Northern Ireland medal, something like that, long service, good conduct medal. Now you have senior non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, senior officers, and they come out the side. It looks, there's so many, and they've got bravery awards. That's something you never saw then. And that changed so much through the 90s and the 2000s. And of course, I think the other thing you would probably say is that now you would get involved in so many different things. So if you look at what the Air Force has been involved in, the search for the missing children in Nigeria, they're still involved in Northern Africa and some of the places there, the flooding, civilian, all the recent flooding over the last couple of years, massive input by the Air Force. And now, although you see it on the news where it says the Army are involved with the COVID effort, it's the military, and a huge proportion of the Air Force is out there dealing with that. So you're much more likely now to be doing something real than what we did, which was train endlessly for an event we never thought would happen.
Yeah. So we're going to run over, guys. I hope no one minds, but I'm enjoying it too much. So Louise Jane, I love her comment. Yay! Shout out to Lynx Aviation Heritage Centre at East Kirby. I'm going there after lockdown. I'm going to queue up or whatever you have to do to get on to taxi. Great question, Stephen Rees. Ben John, my late uncle was a wireless operator in Lancasters in 170 Squadron Bomber Command. He and his Canadian crew were shot down on a night raid on the 21st of February 1945 over Duisburg. He survived and was back on raids in 3 weeks. That's extraordinary. Was that an operational necessity to get back and get flying again?
It was very unusual. It did happen, depending on where they were shot down. So when he said February 45, so it's entirely possible that whilst they were hit going at Duisburg, they may well have managed to get back across Allied lines, if that makes sense, and bail out over areas of France or wherever liberated by the advancing forces. So they did, and there was a few cases where people were shot down in occupied territory and they were held by some of the resistance to get back, and occasionally they went back on operations, but not that often. And so it was unusual to go back on operations, though. Again, if they needed, there was no notion then of you might need a rest, or you might be suffering, or you might need some time off. We needed bomber crews to fight the war. And if you'd just been shot down and you got back and we needed you and your squadron was still active, you were going to go back on operations. And that's the way it was. There was no niceties about this. It was a pretty tough old business.
But was it 30 runs they had to do? Was that their kind of limit? Or?
Yeah, it depended on where and when you were joined, but in general terms, 30 operations was a tour on Bomber Command. Now, many people did one tour, especially if you come up from Canada or something like that, or New Zealand or Australia. You might do your 30 tour of operations and then head home. Certainly, if you're in the UK, you would do your 30 tour of operations, and you would then maybe go do some training. You would help train the new crews. There's a number of stories in the book about people who did approaching their 30 operations, but then they were asked if they wanted to go on to Pathfinders, some of the specialist operations, and they then went on to do maybe 45. Some people did 2 or 3 tours, so there's a couple of some of the more famous people who were awarded Victoria Crosses who kind of had 100+ operations under their belt, combat operations, but they were not the norm. It was generally 30. Some people did 2 tours, so they ended up doing 60 over the course of maybe a couple of years.
Stephen just added a little note there. My uncle was rescued by US forces in Holland,
right?
Which must have been Allied by then.
Yeah.
Alan, luckily he walked the right way towards advancing Allied forces, which is a fortunate thing to do. John Campbell emailed me a question. I've followed you on Twitter for a good while now. I've noticed that and appreciate. I've noticed you appreciate retired police officer you support for your UK service as a whole. Would this have been an alternative career for you if you hadn't joined the RAF? I suppose, what job would you have done if you weren't in the RAF?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I hadn't gone into the RAF, I don't know what I was doing. I was interested in electronics. So back in the 80s, I was interested in electronics, and I joined as an electronics technician. When I left the Air Force, I had no idea what I was going to do. And interestingly, because by then Tornado Down had came out, and when it was announced that I was leaving the Air Force, there was a bit in the media about me leaving the Air Force. And I got offered a job as a combine harvester salesman. That's not a joke. Somebody rang my squadron at Leeming up in Yorkshire and said, don't know what you're going to do. If you haven't got a job lined up, I sell farm machinery. I'll pay you a good salary, good commission, give you a company car, and you can sell combine harvesters. And I, not a word of a lie, nearly took that job. But then my career as a writer really took off. So with the novels that I started writing in 1996, so that, would I be a policeman? I don't know. I mean, I've got a number of cops who are friends, and I am a massive supporter of the Thin Blue Line, massive supporter. I'm not sure that after 16 years in the military, I would have gone on to do that. I know that it is a huge crossover for many people who leave after 10, 12, 15 years to go to continue service like that.
Yes. I've got a very long question from Patrick Quinn, which is referencing ancestry and finding where he could find out more about a relative of his who was in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Where would he go to research that sort of thing? Is that? I mean, I'll send you a fuller question.
I mean, it's the honest. If it's the Royal Canadian Air Force, you may well have to go to the Royal Canadian Air Force and ask them. But if you know that your a relative served in the Royal Air Force, go onto the MOD's website. In fact, just search Google. My RAF father's service records or something like that, and it will come up and you can apply for them. You have to be the next of kin, so it may be, if your mother is still alive, i.e. the husband of the service person, it might need to be signed by her, or if they're both dead and you're the next of kin, you can just apply for them and you can get their service record. You can find out where they served, you can find out what squadron they were on, and then if you're interested in that, you can then go into the records. There are many at the archive at Kew. There are many books written about specific squadrons, and you'll be able to find much more information. Now, I'm not sure about the Royal Canadian Air Force. I presume they have a similar system, but I couldn't say that, to be honest. A simple Google will tell you how you can find your Royal Canadian Air Force's and relatives.
What I might do, John, is I'll send you his email, and you can assist in any way you can. We'll see about that. Gosh, right. So what we're going to do, we're going to call it another 5 minutes. We are going to run over 10 minutes over. Apologies, everyone. Right, Richard Steffi Colbert, which I think might be Max Colbert, who because I saw him yesterday. Richard, my father was a rear gunner in Lancs, but most of his time was spent in Stirlings. What's your knowledge on Stirlings? How do they compare?
Well, it was another one of the giant bombers. So you had, towards the end of the war, you had the Stirlings. They were probably more of a mid-war period, but they're still flying towards the end in different operations. The Lancasters, the Halifaxes were the huge bombers. So it depended on what squadron it was on, what he was on. So My squadron, when I was in the Air Force on Tornadoes, was 15 Squadron, and they flew Sterlings during the war for a short period of time. So it depended on, basically, you were trained as a rear gunner, and then it depended on where the Air Force needed to fill a gap, whether you ended up on which different aircraft you ended up on, and ergo which squadron you were posted to.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just looking at all the notes I've made and how many things I've missed out. There's so many. I'm gonna name check a few things that we could have talked about. Norman Jackson, the VC, where he was hanging out. He basically was extinguishing flames as he was crawling through a wing, right, and then hanging out of the. That's an extraordinary one. We did talk about committee of adjustment. We talked about our. Oh no, I went on a sortie. We won't talk about that. Right, let's do a question from. I also had a taxi in a rear turret of a Lanc in East Cubbies. That's Steffi. Yeah, well done. I've got to ask, why a picture of a Buccaneer alongside the Tornadoes behind you? Did you serve fly on them? That's from Swan.
These are, let me just move out of the way. So these are my Gulf War prints. There's another one over here. So you've got over here, that's the Tornado F3. This is the Buccaneer, and that's the Tornado GR1 that I flew. And this is a signed set by all of the senior commanders. There's a Jaguar up above my desk. These are signed by the senior commanders, and it's a collector's set. And it represents the RAF aircraft that flew in the Gulf in 1991. So that's what decorates my wall.
Brilliant, brilliant. Understand that. Message from Anna H, which probably answers one of the Patrick Quinn's. Anna, I don't know who Anna H is, but this is very impressive. The Bomber Command Digital Archive is preserving documents from all over the world, including logbooks, photographs, letters, and service citations. The archive also contains all histories of those involved from all sides, ensuring that their first-hand experiences are preserved. That's a very long bit. I'm not going to read it all, but so there could be elements of there with Bomber Command's digital archive. So that maybe
that's the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln. An amazing place to visit. Beautiful memorial. Beautiful place to visit. Their online archive is astonishing, and their physical archive is astonishing. And they've got thousands and thousands of records of Bomber Command veterans who have recorded their stories, who have told their stories, and the squadron history. So a great place to go if you're looking to research the story.
And they do cover Canada, Anna's added. Margaret Baxter, my father-in-law worked on airborne radar with Bernard Lovell. How did that impact the Lancaster? Was there any kind of
Yes. So the Lancaster had a couple of different systems. One of them to aid with navigation, it had a radar system, which a radar could paint the ground, could look at the ground ahead, and if you could. So, for instance, if you could look at a coastline and identify a specific point on a coastline, you knew where the radar was pointed. So and you knew what direction was pointed. So you could work out very, very accurately where you were, if that makes sense, because you knew the distance to the fixed point on the ground. It also had a couple of systems that could detect German radar. So if a fighter equipped with radar was homing in on you, it could do that as well. So it had a number of applications in the Lancaster.
I've got, I'm just trawling back through anything I might have missed. Evan and Eleanor. It's Evan, his birthday boy. Hello, Evan.
Yes.
Were you in the Air Training Corps? I think Evan might be young. I can't tell.
Evan is 16. It's Evan's birthday today, Ben. He's one of the names.
How did it impact your career? Were you in the Air Training Corps?
No, I wasn't. So Evan is 16 today. It's his birthday today. So his mum. Okay. No, I don't know. I mean, his mum tweeted me this morning, so I sent him an invitation as a little birthday present to join this. So happy birthday, Evan. He's in the Air Training Corps. No, I wasn't. I was in the Scouts. A big part of my life in the Northeast, right until I joined the Air Force when I was 16. But any of these youth organizations are fantastic for our young people. Young people sometimes get a bit of a rough time at the moment. You know, there are many, many young people out there doing great things. And I think the youth organizations of the Air Cadets, the Army Cadets, the Navy Cadets, the Marine Cadets, the Scouts, all of those different types of service focused organization really do help our young people develop.
Yes, I totally agree. Totally. Just trawling back even further, I missed a question from Will. Does John know what other countries' view was on the Lancaster? Did the US, for example, look at it and its bomb capacity, specialist bomb it could carry, and take any lessons or inspiration from it?
I think that if you look at the way that the war was being fought, you know, there was very little cross discussion. The Americans had their systems, the Americans had their aircraft, they had their ways of operating, their ways of bombing, and it was not very, it was actually quite rare that they would operate together. In fact, it was very rare. They would operate after, so you might have the Americans going over a target, and then 2 hours later, the Lancasters going over a target, but there wasn't a huge amount of crosswork now.
Louise Jane, has John visited Harris's office preserved at RAF High Wycombe?
I haven't. I spoke to somebody who worked for Harris, in actual fact, his secretary. I spoke to her for one of the other books that I wrote, which featured Harris a little bit more, but I haven't been to his office. I have seen the pictures of it.
Yes, ooh, a debatable one, a contentious one here from John Lake. How might the war have turned out had the UK invested in the Mosquito rather than the Lanc, seemingly delivering more bombs on target more accurately and with far fewer losses?
Well, I mean, this is John's an aviation writer. I mean, the thing is, what you can always sit back and say, what if? And so the answer is, I don't know what would have happened. Instead of building 7,377 Lancasters, we built 7,377 Mosquitoes. I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think anybody knows. And I think the whole point is that you can always second guess, and you can always go back and say, if they had done this, it would have been different. And maybe it would have been, but it would have had you don't have an effect in isolation. And so, yes, if they had not had the mass attacks on some of the industrial heartlands, it may have been different if they'd have used Mosquitoes. But I don't think that you can say that A caused B and ergo C would have happened and the war would have been longer, shorter, fewer people were killed. I don't think you can do that when you're looking at something so massive as an all-out war like that.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Right, I'm going to sort of draw things to a close. There's a few points I noted towards the end of the book. Some of the lovely things the Lancasters did towards the end of the war. For instance, the manna from heaven, delivering food to the Dutch who were starving, literally starving, had no food whatsoever. So there were 6,684 tons of food delivered via, and they literally flew in at low level and dropped.
Into occupied Holland as well. Holland was still occupied when they were doing this, so they were liaising with the Germans so that the Lancasters could bring the food in. They were literally bombing, bombing the parks with food. They're just dropping them out the bottom of the Lancaster. Nothing that they'd ever trained for before, and it was a trial and error. But yes, they were delivering huge amounts of food for the starving population. The people who were involved in it spoke about it with real fondness, that they weren't taking lives, they were saving lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other story I was quite amused by was Cook's Tours. The idea of Cook's was a travel agent or something that existed back then as well, and so they used to take those staff that had been in the UK on the administrative or the technical front, hadn't flown at all, so they give them Cook's Tours, which just seems like a very nice thing. I've had some lovely comments from people just saying, Patrick Quinn, thanks for asking my questions, John. Just in reference to the question about the Harris room in Wycombe, my fiance works in the office next door. If John wants a tour,
that's very kind. Thank you.
That. I wonder if I can muscle in on that as well. That would be nice. And I'm going to stop there. Louis, has John been to Betty's in York and seen the etchings and the mirrors from the aircrew?
Betty's in York, the tea shop in York. Yes, I have. Yeah, you'll find there's a number of different pubs around Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, where there's still the very real remnants of the wartime crews that relax there with the local girls. There's a couple of those stories in the book as well, Ben.
Lovely, lovely. Well, it's a lovely place to finish. Betty's in York. That's my home city. So all good. Listen, can I just say how lovely you've been? Can I say how wonderful the crowd have been, badgering me with lovely questions, the emails and everything else. I'm going to finish with one question. What are you on now? And keep in mind, I know the answer. And when do you publish it?
I am, so as I said, I can't do another World War II book, so the next book is this one. So that's a photograph taken over Baghdad in February 1991, tornadoes dropping laser-guided bombs. I wasn't there by then. I was sitting on my fat backside as a prisoner of war in Baghdad by then. That was my mates doing that. And so I'm telling the story of the tornado during the First Gulf War in the same way that I told the Lancaster. So the families, the friends, the men, and it was men then because it was only male pilots, of course, back then, and what they went through and how it affected them, telling the story of the tornado through their eyes. And it's in June next year. Well, if I ever get it finished, Ben, it'll be June next year.
June next year. So what I'm proposing is you come to our book festival in November, so and we can do this all again. Hopefully, well,
if we're allowed to meet again, by then,
we'll make it work. I mean, I did a hybrid event in last month, and that worked. And in fact, I was hoping ours could have been. Anyway, rabbiting. So thank you all for watching. Our numbers have stayed true, even though we're just chin-wagging now. So thank you, guys. Thank you, John. I will be in touch with various bits and pieces, and yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's been a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be interviewed by somebody who's read the book and who knows something about the subject. And I hope that everybody watching has enjoyed themselves. And so thank you to all of the audience for being with us and for buying the book or just being part of the chat, and especially, Ben, to you and your colleagues in the independent bookshops. They are the heart of the community. They really mean something, and I would urge everybody, if they can, to buy their books from an independent bookshop on the high street.
That's right. We're taking orders. In fact, most of your books because everyone's had to get the book to join this event. All your books are sitting there in the shop. So those who are picking up, come and get them tomorrow. You can hand them across the door. Those that have taken the postage option, they're going in the post tomorrow. So you'll have them, God willing, by the weekend from with our postage, with whatever. Yeah. Good. Thank you so much, everyone. I will see you. Well, Wednesday we've got Ben McIntyre. That's our next one.
Oh, fantastic! He's brilliant.
In fact, Roger Moorhouse, who's watching this event, he's going to be interviewing Ben, and his. God, I can't remember his book now. Agent Sonia, isn't it? Agent Sonia. Is it?
Which book is Ben talking about?
Agent Sonia. It's the new one.
Oh, fantastic! Great. I mean, listen, he's a brilliant author, and I know that Roger is going to be as completely together as you are with your questioning, and he'll be all over that book. He'll have read it. Won't you, Roger? If you're watching, I know you will.
Yes, he will. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, guys, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks. Thank you. All the best, Ben. Bye-bye.